We like to be in control, don't we? We love to be in control. How many of you have ever gotten on an elevator and pushed the floor number and then pushed the close button door underneath it? How many of you have ever done that? I've done that hundreds of times. But recently I learned that button doesn't work at all. It hasn't worked for 35 years. Since the ADA requirements for buildings in 1990, all elevator doors are programmed to stay open for a minimum of 3 seconds. So, you say, why are those buttons even there? Because when firefighters insert their key, those buttons are activated immediately. For you and me, they're just placebo buttons. I'm sorry to burst your bubble. There was an article about this a few weeks ago in the Wall Street Journal, and Harvard psychologist Ellen Langer said there is a reason we press that non-functioning button, and I'm quoting directly from what it said. Perceived control is very important. It diminishes stress and promotes well-being. When you find yourself pressing a non-functional closed door button and later the doors close, you'll probably never notice the delay because a little spurt of happiness will cascade through your brain once you see that what you believe is a response to your action. You can punch it all you want to, and it's going to stay open 3 seconds. That's the law. We love to be in control, don't we? I actually heard of a church one time that posted several thermostats around the building, and they were dummy thermostats, so people could go in an area they were sitting and think they were picking the temperature in the building, which is always an issue. And they were dummy thermostats. Pretty smart church, I think. You know, when you first get married, I don't know how many of you remember when you first get married, but one of the first things that come up are control issues in the marriage. Who is going to control basically the other person? Who is going to control the other person? But certainly who is going to control certain things in the marriage. And so Diane and I had those similar problems right when we got married, and I thought, I better get control of this issue pretty quick. I better straighten this out pretty quick. So I did. I sat her down and I said, now look, I'm going to handle the big stuff, all the big stuff. You're going to handle the small stuff. She said, what's the small stuff? I said, you're going to handle all the money. I do not have any idea how much money we have, where it is. I couldn't tell you what bank to go to. I'm serious. You think I'm kidding? I don't know what our banks are. I don't know a PIN number. There are so many things I don't know. If I had to go get money, I couldn't do it without begging her to go with me. I said, you're going to control all the money. I said, you're going to control all the food decisions and all the choices because I can't cook. If I know I look bad enough already, but you ought to see if I was on my own, cooking and preparing food for myself. So you're going to control all the food. You will do all the cooking. You'll do all that. I said, you're going to control all the family issues, all the family issues. So whenever the 4 grandchildren are coming to our house, I don't even know it usually till they get there. She controls all of that. She knows every single person in our family on all sides, even the young children. She knows their names. She knows their birth dates. I am vaguely aware there are some little people in our family somewhere. So she controls all the little stuff. I, however, I have full and total control of the remote control. That is the greatest power and the greatest control in the entire family. I have full and total control of what sports teams we follow. She has no input there whatsoever. None. All me. So control issues are the kind of thing you really need to think about. And we're going to study a passage of Scripture today where we learn that everything that is said and done, God is ultimately in control. We may like to think we're in control, but God is in control of just about everything. Now, I'm going to show you there's one thing God is not in control of. But God is in control of just about everything. We're in John chapter 11, and Jesus has just called Lazarus out of the tomb where he had been dead for 4 days. And when I think about some of the scenes in the Bible I would have loved to have been present for, that's one of them. I got to tell you, that's in my top 5 or 6. Can you imagine Jesus shows up, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days in the tomb, and Jesus shows up and all these paid mourners are out there, and Mary and Martha are going crazy, as they should, that their brother is dead, and they're crying, and Jesus weeps himself, even though he knows he's about to raise him from the dead. And then all of a sudden he says, Lazarus, come forth. And I'm telling you, if there are any other people named Lazarus in those tombs, they came out of there too. He said, Lazarus, come forth. And Lazarus rises up from the dead and is resurrected. I'd have loved to have been there for that. And our text takes place immediately after that. You would think that everyone would believe in Jesus after a miracle like that. Who could see a man who's been dead for 4 days walking up and speaking to them and not believe in Jesus as the Son of God, as the true Messiah? But there were still some skeptics. And most of those skeptics were the Sadducees among the Jews. And because they were so skeptical, that's why they were sad, you see. You'll get that later, around lunchtime. So let me push the right button and get in the right area to our text. Many of the people who were with Mary believed in Jesus when they saw this happen, but some went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the leading priest and the Pharisees called the high council together and said, what are we going to do? This man certainly performs many miraculous signs. If we allow him to go on like this, soon everybody's going to believe in him. Then the Roman army will come and destroy both our temple and our nation. Caiaphas, who was high priest at the time, said, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't realize that it's better for you that one man should die for the people than the whole nation to be destroyed. And he didn't say this on his own. As high priest at that time, he was led to prophesy that Jesus would die for the entire nation. Now, this is a little complicated, but I want you to keep those 2 sentences in your head here for the next few minutes. And not only for that nation, but to bring together and unite all children of God scattered around the world. So from that time on, the Jewish leaders began to plot Jesus' death. And as a result, Jesus stopped his public ministry among the people and left Jerusalem. He went to the village of Ephraim and stayed there with his disciples. It was almost time now for the Jewish Passover celebration, and many people from all over the country arrived in Jerusalem several days early so they could go through the purification ceremony before Passover began. And they kept looking for Jesus. But as they stood around in the temple, they said to each other, what do you think? He won't come for Passover, will he? Meanwhile, the leading priests and Pharisees had publicly ordered that anyone seeing Jesus must report it immediately so they could arrest him. To me, this is one of the most interesting passages in all the Bible because it shows that God has the power to speak through someone like the high priest, Caiaphas, without Caiaphas even realizing what was happening. All through John's gospel, the enemies of Jesus have opposed him. They've tried to trick him to make him incriminate himself. And finally, after this Lazarus miracle that was so open and so public and a dead man is now walking around, They realize they got to do something. They can't just think about it anymore. They got to act. Something must be done. So they decide they're going to kill him. And for these Jewish leaders, this was a real crisis. It was both a political and a religious crisis because the Romans were the occupying force, but these Jewish leaders were in charge of religion. And they saw their followers leaving them slowly but surely, one by one, to follow this rebel-rousing rabbi. They were in both a political and a spiritual crisis. I think it's safe to say that we're in a political and spiritual crisis in our nation right now. All you have to do is turn on the television news or open a newspaper and you'll see that we are in a political and spiritual crisis. And I see some real similarities with this passage to where we are today. And so I want you to notice that there are three ways given in this text that people can react to a crisis. And all three of these ways are applicable to every single one of us right now, living in 2025 America. The first way you can respond is with anxiety. It's out of control. Everything's out of control. The Sanhedrin was made up of 70 Jewish leaders, and they were divided between two parties, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, that never got along. You could call them the Republicans and the Democrats, for that matter. They were the Pharisees, the conservatives, and there were the Sadducees, who were the liberals, and they were always arguing. Does that sound familiar to anybody? And we know at least one member, Nicodemus, who probably believed in Jesus. But the rest of them were all a part of the Never Jesus movement. He is not a Messiah. Never has been, never will be. The one thing these two parties, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, agreed on was this: Jesus has got to go. And we just read it. They now say it openly. And so some of these leaders are filled with anxiety. They're thinking the situation is getting out of control. If we don't do something about this Jesus, the Romans are going to come for us and destroy our nation. They said it outright. And these worried individuals, these anxious individuals, were rushing to see the worst case scenario. And today there are people who are chronic worriers, who are always trying to see the worst case scenario. When faced with a crisis, they immediately default to anxiety. When faced with a crisis, they immediately default to the worst case scenario. Some people right now are saying our nation has never been more divided than it is now. I do not believe that. I grew up in the 1960s, where in a span of 5 years, all three of these leaders were assassinated publicly. All of them led to rioting in the streets. I grew up in the 60s, where on Kent State University, students were shot to death by the police at Kent State. I grew up in the 1960s, where in the Vietnam War, thousands and thousands and thousands of our poorest and most innocent kids were sacrificed for basically no reason at all, no cause at all. The government never settled what we were there to do. I grew up in the 60s, where there were constant riots in the streets, constant issues. And by the way, let's not even talk about the 60s if you want to talk about the worst times for our nation. Some of you may remember from history books, there was this little thing called the Civil War that wasn't quite so civil. And more Americans died in the Civil War than died in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, the Gulf War combined. Combined. Where you have people, you're going to have disagreements. You simply are. And you're going to have anxiety. And you're going to have people like in this text who are worried. What are we going to do about this Jesus? They said, if we don't do something, the Romans are going to come and it's not going to be good. Things are out of control. Let me tell you, if you ever struggle with anxiety, here's what you should do. I'm not telling you to do anything I hadn't done myself. This is my most common, I would say, prayer of the heart. Philippians 4, 6, and 7 is my most common, I think, prayer of the heart. And if you ever struggle with anxiety, I would challenge you to write this down, put it in several places where you go daily, your bedroom, your bathroom, your car, wherever you go daily, your office, wherever you go daily. And repeat it and repeat it and repeat it until you have memorized it, until you have made it a part of your heart, your mind, and your soul. Would you read it aloud with me, please? Don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Tell God what you need and thank Him for all He has done. Then you will experience God's peace, which exceeds anything we can understand. His peace will guard your hearts and minds as you live in Christ Jesus. Anxiety is a response that says, everything's out of control. Prayer and dependence upon God says, no, God's in control, and I'll trust Him. There's a second response that's very evident in this text, and that is arrogance. The arrogance to say, I'm in control. Doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. I'm in control. And that was the reaction of Caiaphas, the high priest. Now, you need to understand that during this time, the high priest was appointed by the Roman authorities, and it usually went to the Jew who offered them the most money. It was corrupt as all get out. And Caiaphas was brutal, and he was rich because he had served at this point for 18 years as the high priest. He was a member of the Sadducees, who didn't believe in the miracles of the Bible, didn't believe in the angels, didn't believe in heaven even. The conservative Pharisees hated the Roman invaders, but the Sadducees, like Caiaphas, were more partners with them. They sort of adopted Roman dress and Roman customs. You saw some of that if you watched The Chosen. The Sadducees were really a little bit, you might say, kind of like the Jewish mafia. And Caiaphas was the godfather. And can't you hear the 70 leaders in the Sanhedrin arguing about what should be done? And all of a sudden, the godfather raises his hand, and there is silence because everybody fears Caiaphas and what he can do. And he starts with an insult. And I'm just sort of paraphrasing it, and he says, "You guys don't know nothing. We'll kill him. We will kill him stone dead." That's what we'll do. It's better that one man dies than the whole nation for the Romans coming after us. I'll find someone on the inside and make him an offer that he can't refuse. Caiaphas is an example of a self-centered man who thinks he controls his own destiny. Many world leaders have thought that too, even in recent days. When there's a problem, Caiaphas can fix it because, after all, he's a fixer. This is the kind of person who doesn't really have any need for God. And Caiaphas does not understand that the heart of the problem is the problem of the heart. As Jeremiah the prophet said, the human heart is the most deceitful of all things and desperately wicked. Who really knows how bad it is? There's a widespread humanist, socialist movement in America today that says we can solve our own problems. Do not be misled. The humanist, materialistic, socialist movement is anti-God at every level of it. And it says we don't need God. We can solve our own problems. Timothy McVeigh was the Oklahoma City domestic terrorist who killed 168 people. And just before he was executed, his last words, they always give last words to an executed prisoner. And he said his last words were the poem Invictus, and the final stanza says, "It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments of the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." How arrogant. And within 1 second after they dropped that electric bolt, he found out that wasn't true. That wasn't true. Beware of any arrogant attitude that tempts you to think you can control everything that happens, because you can't. What were the responses here on this day after Lazarus was raised? There was a lot of anxiety. It's out of control. We can't control it. There was the arrogance of Caiaphas. I can control it. Here's what we'll do. We'll kill this Jesus. And then there is the third response, which is the proper response, not only for them, but for us. And that is assurance that God is in complete control. This, my friends, should be our reaction to any crisis that we face. God is in complete control. Assurance is better than insurance. With insurance, you're betting that things will go wrong so you'll be covered and get a benefit. With assurance, you know that whatever happens, you'll get benefits. You'll get eternal benefits. Whatever happens, God is in control. It doesn't matter the nature or the severity of the crisis that we face. God is in control. It may be a personal crisis. It may be a national crisis. It may be a global crisis. God is in control. And just one more proof that this is true, and it's found in John's explanation of the statement that Caiaphas made. And it's what I asked you a few minutes ago to park in your brain and bring back to recollection. And not only for that nation, but to bring together and unite all the children of God scattered around the world. So from that time on, the Jewish leaders began to plot Jesus' death. This is one of the most amazing things in all of the Bible, my friends. The godfather of the Jewish mafia was planning to snuff out Jesus to serve his own selfish plans and to save the Sadducees and benefit the Romans. And mean old Caiaphas thought he was saying Jesus would die instead of the nation. You read the text as many times as you want to read it. He was saying Jesus would die instead of the nation dying. Better for one man to die than the whole nation to die. But God turned it around to mean one man, Jesus, would die for the nation. And not just for the nation of Israel, but for everyone who would live through all time. Jesus would die on behalf of everybody who would ever be a part of God's family. That's you, that's me. Caiaphas, in his arrogance, said, better that one man die than the whole nation die. God twisted his own words and their meaning to say, no, better that one man die for the nation and for everybody else. What a powerful proof that our God is an awesome God. What a powerful proof that our God is sovereign in the heavens. There are many scriptures that tell us God is in control. We had heard one of them read for us by Brady this morning from Psalm chapter 8. The reason I chose that passage is it speaks about the great sovereignty of God. In 1 Chronicles chapter 29, here's how King David expressed it. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness, the power, the glory, the victory, and the majesty. Everything in the heavens and on earth is yours, O Lord, and this is your kingdom. We adore you as the one who is over all things. So what does that all mean? It means, as I wrap toward a conclusion, there are two things that God is definitely in control of, and one that he's not. Interesting, isn't it? What's that one that he's not? I'll get there in a minute. God controls creation. God created everything in the universe. He exercises control over his creation. Astrophysicists tell us that the universe is mostly space. If you remember, Despicable Me, Gru had a shrink gun and shrunk the moon to the size of an orange. And when he did, surfers lost their waves. For comparison's sake, let's imagine I could shrink the earth with a gun to the size of a tennis ball. The moon would then be the size of a marble 6 feet away. The sun would be the size of a UPS truck driving along Colonial Boulevard right now. In the other direction, the planet Neptune would be the size of a cantaloupe up on I-75. All these planets are in orbit around the sun so that every 365 and a quarter days we make a loop. There's a reason we call it outer space, or space, the final frontier. One of my favorite comedians, the old dry, witty comedian Stephen Wright, says that according to the Hubble telescope, the universe is expanding, so that should help us with our parking problems. Put away your telescope. Exchange it for a microscope for just a moment. All matter, where did matter come from? All matter is comprised of invisible molecules made up of atoms. Those atoms are comprised of protons and neutrons and electrons and croutons. And I just trying to see if you were listening. It was brutally obvious that some of you weren't. And these electrons are in orbit around the protons and the neutrons. So as intelligent creatures, we study the universe and matter, but two questions scientists have never truly answered. How did we get here? Where did the first matter come from? Zero answer on that. And second question is, what keeps it all together? Why doesn't the earth just go spinning off in orbit? Why don't the atoms just split apart naturally like, according to their belief system, they once did? Well, here's the answer to both the questions in Colossians chapter 1. For through him is Jesus, God created everything in the heavenly realms and on earth. He made the things we can see and the things we can't see, such as thrones, kingdoms, rulers, authorities in the unseen world. Everything was created through him and for him. He existed before anything else. That's where we came from. That's the answer to question number one. And he holds all creation together. That's the answer to question number two. How does it all hold together? And you either believe that or you don't. It's that simple. It really is true, my friends, that he's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole wide world in his hands. It's true. It's what the scripture says. And he's got me and he's got you, brother and sister, in his hands. And the one who holds the whole universe together can hold your life together. So don't be anxious. Pray about everything and don't worry about anything. But then he also controls circumstances. I love the story of Joseph in the Old Testament. Joseph was hated by his brothers, and he faced all kinds of adversity, and it coat of many colors and all that, you know. And he went from a pit to a prison and finally to a palace. But all the time, Joseph knew that God was the one orchestrating his circumstances. And toward the end of his life, he said to his brothers when he revealed himself to them, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people." God's in control of circumstances. God is. Isaiah says, "Remember the things that I have done in the past, for I alone am God. I am God, and there is none like me. Only I can tell you the future before it even happens. Everything I plan will come to pass, for I do whatever I wish." The word coincidence is not a part of God's vocabulary. What you and I may look at as random events, chance encounters, arbitrary connections are actually orchestrated events in both the purpose and in the plan of God. God, you might say, is sitting behind the steering wheel of history. Sometimes he's on the main highway, it seems to us. Sometimes he seems like he's on the back alley. Sometimes it looks like he's going the wrong way on a one-way street. But whatever the case, he's not. His intentions are good and his plans are providential. It is called the sovereignty of God. I've spent the last year or two studying in depth the one subject, I've mentioned this a few times, the one subject I've studied more than any other in the last year or two is the sovereignty of God. To me, it is the key to Christian understanding. I have come to a very, very firm belief in the sovereignty of God. God controls creation. And God controls our circumstances because he's sovereign. But then, in these control issues area, there's one thing he doesn't control. Our choices. Our choices. One of the greatest questions of Christianity is not, do we have free will? Because that's apparent in so many scriptures. In verse 45, we see two groups of people expressing free will. Some of the people who saw Lazarus alive believed in Jesus. It was their choice. Some of the people who saw Lazarus alive didn't believe and instead went to the Pharisees to tell them what Jesus had done. And the Pharisees then made a plan to kill him. Some people followed Jesus, some people opposed Jesus. I personally don't understand for the life of me how someone can see a man alive who had been dead 4 days earlier and not believe in Jesus. But skepticism can run deep, and sometimes it's easier to just believe it was done with smoke and mirrors. I honestly believe, and I'm telling you this honestly, I honestly believe it takes way more faith to be an atheist or an agnostic than it does to be a Christian. God gives us a choice, though. Before Joshua died, he left this choice to the people. If you refuse to serve the Lord, then choose today whom you will serve. Would you prefer the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates? Or will it be the gods of the Amorites in the land in which you now live? But as for me and my family, we will choose to serve the Lord. God created Adam and Eve to live in a perfect garden. Perfection, sinless. But he didn't make them robots. He didn't make them robots with no ability whatsoever to choose. He wanted them to choose to love and to obey him. We don't know how long they were there. How long were they there before they sinned? 100 days, 100 years, 100,000 years? We don't know. We do know when they made the wrong choice, they suffered the consequences. This is where you have a harmony between free will and the sovereignty of God. We are free to choose, as these men and women did. We can go for or against Jesus, but then we cannot choose the consequences. consequences will invariably follow according to the program and choice of the sovereignty of God. God is in control. Here's the takeaway. God could use an evil leader like Caiaphas to speak his truth. God could turn Caiaphas' message around and make it sound like what God wanted it to say rather than what Caiaphas meant for it to say. Isn't that great? God used a pagan king like Nebuchadnezzar as his instrument to punish the Jews. God once used a donkey to deliver his message. The story is found in Numbers 22. Balaam was invited by King Moab to curse Moses and the Israeli army, and God told Balaam not to do that. And Balaam decided to accept the offer because he wanted the money. So God sent an angel with a sword to stop Balaam, and he used his donkey to warn him and stop him. If you are a donkey, or some derivative of that term, God can shouldn't have said that. Only because it broke a serious moment. God can still use you. My friend, God is in control. And if he can use the high priest, Caiaphas, like a 2-year-old swirling him around, if he can use a donkey, he can use you. He can use me. He can use anybody.